Welcome. Today I'm going to tell you Janet's incredible story. Be sure to watch the video to the end to get the gist of it. You'll be shocked at the end, but before you start, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Janet had always been a kind-hearted person. She had been raised to believe in helping others and doing what she could to make the world a better place. It was this sense of altruism that led her to give all her money to a gypsy woman she met on the street. The gypsy woman had approached Janet with a sad tale of woe. She claimed that her caravan had been destroyed in a fire, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back. Janet felt sorry for the woman and wanted to help in any way she could. So she gave the gypsy woman all the money she had on her, which was her last paycheck from her part-time job. Janet knew that she would have to find a way to make ends meet until her next payday, but she didn't mind. She felt good about helping someone in need, even if it meant making a few sacrifices of her own. As she walked away from the gypsy woman, Janet felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over her. It was as if she had done something important, something meaningful. She didn't know it at the time, but that act of kindness would lead her down a path that she never could have imagined. Janet was married to a man named David. They had been together for 10 years and had always been very close. But lately, things had started to change. David had become distant and secretive, spending more and more time away from home. Janet didn't know what to make of it, but she sensed that something was wrong. One day, Janet came home to find a note from David saying that he had gone away for a while and that she shouldn't try to find him. Janet was devastated. She had no idea where he could have gone or why he would leave without telling her. She tried calling him, but his phone was disconnected. She tried reaching out to his friends and family, but nobody had seen or heard from him. Janet was at a loss. She felt like her world was falling apart, and she didn't know what to do. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, Janet's desperation grew. She couldn't sleep, she couldn't eat. She couldn't focus on anything other than finding her husband. She scoured the city, put up flyers, and hired private investigators, but all to no avail. David had vanished without a trace. Janet was about to give up hope when she had a chance encounter with the same gypsy woman she had given her last paycheck to. The woman seemed to recognize Janet and greeted her warmly. Janet was surprised but pleased to see her again. The gypsy woman invited Janet to sit down and have her fortune read. Janet was hesitant at first, but the woman's gentle manner put her at ease. As the gypsy woman laid out her cards, Janet couldn't help but feel skeptical. She didn't believe in this sort of thing, but she had nothing to lose. The gypsy woman's predictions were vague and unremarkable until she turned over the final card. Deception, the woman said, but not from where you expect it. Look for the missing piece, and you will find your answer. Janet was confused. She didn't know what the gypsy woman meant, but something about those words sent a chill down her spine. She thanked the woman and left, feeling more unsettled than ever. Janet couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important about what the gypsy woman had said. She didn't know what it meant, but she felt like she had to keep searching for answers. As she continued her quest to find her missing husband, Janet began to notice things that she had never seen before. Little clues and hints that seemed to point in different directions. She followed them all, not knowing which one would lead her to the truth. Then one day, Janet received a package in the mail. It was from David, and it contained a letter and a key. In the letter, David explained that he had been struggling with a gambling addiction and had run up huge debts. He couldn't bear to face Janet and had fled, hoping to find a way to pay off his debts and start over. The key, David explained, was to a safety deposit box where he had hidden all the evidence of his gambling and the money he had won and lost. He begged Janet to forgive him and promised to come home as soon as he could. Janet was shocked and heartbroken. She had no idea that David had been struggling with such a terrible addiction. But now that she knew the truth, she felt like she could finally start to heal. She went to the bank and opened the safety deposit box. Inside, she found stacks of cash, receipts from casinos, and a ledger detailing every bet David had made. Janet was overwhelmed by the amount of money that had been lost, but she was also relieved to have found the missing piece of the puzzle. Then, as she was about to leave the bank, Janet saw the gypsy woman again. This time, the woman beckoned her over and whispered 3 words that sent a shockwave through Janet's body. The gypsy woman whispered, "He's not dead." Janet was taken aback. She didn't know what to make of the woman's words. Was the gypsy woman saying that David was still alive? It seemed impossible, but Janet had learned not to discount the power of intuition. She thanked the woman and left the bank, feeling more confused than ever. As she walked down the street, Janet couldn't help but feel like there was more to the story than she had uncovered. She decided to follow the gypsy woman to see if she could learn more. The woman led Janet to a rundown apartment building on the outskirts of the city. She knocked on one of the doors, and a man answered. Janet didn't recognize him at first, but then she realized that it was David. He was thin and haggard, but he was alive. Janet was overjoyed and overwhelmed with emotion. David explained that he had been staying with an old friend who had helped him get back on his feet. He had been too ashamed to come home, but now that he had cleaned up his act, he was ready to face Janet and make things right. Janet and David embraced, and for the first time in months, Janet felt like everything was going to be okay. But then David told her something that shattered her world all over again. He revealed that he had been involved with a group of criminals who had been using him to launder money. David had gotten in over his head and had stolen a large sum of cash from them. He had been hiding out in the apartment, waiting for the heat to die down, but he knew that he couldn't hide forever. Janet was horrified. She didn't know what to do. She had always trusted David, and now she realized that he had been living a double life. She felt like she didn't even know the man she had married. Just then, there was a knock at the door. David's face went pale. He knew that the criminals had found him. David and Janet were frozen in fear as the knocking grew louder and more insistent. David motioned for Janet to hide in the bedroom while he went to see who was at the door. When he opened it, 2 rough-looking men burst in and demanded to know where the money was. David tried to explain that he didn't have it anymore, but the men didn't believe him. They roughed him up and threatened to kill him if he didn't produce the cash. Janet heard the commotion and knew that she had to act fast. She grabbed a lamp and crept towards the living room. When she saw David being beaten, something inside her snapped. She charged at the men, swinging the lamp with all her might. The men were caught off guard, and Janet managed to knock one of them out. The other one turned on her, but David recovered enough to grab a kitchen knife and stab him. Janet and David were both covered in blood, but they were alive. They hugged each other, tears streaming down their faces. But their relief was short-lived. The sound of sirens could be heard in the distance, and Janet knew that they had to get out of there before the police arrived. They grabbed what they could and fled the apartment, not knowing where they were going or what they were going to do next. As they ran through the streets, Janet felt like her world had been turned upside down. She didn't know who to trust or where to turn. But she knew that she had to keep going, for David's sake and for her own. They eventually made their way to a small town on the outskirts of the city. They rented a small cottage and tried to start over. But the past continued to haunt them, and they knew that they could never truly escape it. Janet and David spent months living in fear, never knowing when the criminals would find them again. They tried to keep a low profile, but they knew that they were always at risk. Despite the danger, Janet was determined to make things right. She convinced David to turn himself in and confess to what he had done. She knew that it was the only way that they could move on with their lives. David was reluctant at first, but he eventually agreed. They went to the police station and told the whole story. They were both arrested and taken into custody. At first, things seemed hopeless. The evidence against David was overwhelming, and the prosecution was seeking a long prison sentence. But then something unexpected happened. The gypsy woman who had given Janet the cryptic message came forward. She claimed to have information that could exonerate David. The woman told the court that she had been visited by one of the criminals who had stolen the money. He had threatened her and demanded that she provide an alibi for him. She had refused and had gone to the police instead. The woman's testimony was enough to convince the jury that David had been coerced into committing the crime. He was found guilty but was given a much lighter sentence than he would have otherwise. Just a minute, dear viewer. Before I continue, I highly recommend subscribing to my channel and giving this video a like, because I'm trying just for you. New videos every day. Let's continue. Janet and David were both relieved and grateful. They knew that they still had a long road ahead of them, but they were ready to face whatever came their way. As they walked out of the courthouse, Janet felt like she had finally found closure. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that she and David would face it together. But then something happened that Janet never could have expected. As they were leaving the courthouse, the gypsy woman approached them and handed Janet a slip of paper. On it were 3 words, "I forgive you." Janet was stunned. She didn't understand why the woman was forgiving her. She had done nothing wrong. But then the woman spoke. "You gave me your last money, and it saved my life. I will never forget that." Janet realized that the woman had mistaken her for someone else, but she was still overwhelmed with gratitude. She hugged the woman, tears streaming down her face. As she and David walked away, Janet felt like everything was going to be okay. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that they had been given a second chance, and they were going to make the most of it. Months passed, and Janet and David slowly started to rebuild their lives. They moved to a small town in a different state and tried to start fresh. Janet got a job as a waitress at a local diner, and David found work as a mechanic. They lived in a small apartment and tried to keep a low profile. Despite their efforts, they still lived in fear. They were always looking over their shoulders, afraid that the criminals would find them again. One day, while Janet was at work, a man walked into the diner. He was tall and had a menacing look in his eye. Janet recognized him immediately. He was one of the men who had robbed them. Janet's heart raced as the man walked towards her. She wanted to run, but she was frozen in fear. The man stopped in front of her and spoke in a low voice. "I know who you are, Janet, and I know what you did." Janet was terrified. She didn't know what to do. The man continued, "But I'm not here to hurt you. I'm here to offer you a deal." Janet looked at him skeptically. The man spoke again. "I know where your husband is, and I can help you find him." Janet was shocked. She had given up hope of ever finding David again. The man continued, "But you have to do something for me. You have to give me the money back. All of it." Janet was torn. She didn't want to give up the money, but she also wanted to find David. The man could see the hesitation in her eyes. He leaned in closer and whispered, "Think about it. I'll be in touch." And with that, he turned and walked out of the diner. Janet was left with a sinking feeling in her stomach. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know who to trust. Janet spent the rest of the day in a daze. She couldn't believe that the man who had robbed them was now offering to help find David. She didn't know whether to trust him or not. That night, Janet told David about the encounter at the diner. David was just as skeptical as Janet. He didn't want to get their hopes up again. But as the days passed, Janet couldn't stop thinking about the man's offer. She knew it was a risk, but she also knew that she had to do whatever it took to find David. One afternoon, Janet received a call from the man. He gave her an address and told her to meet him there later that night. Janet was nervous, but she knew that she had to go. She didn't tell David where she was going. She didn't want to get his hopes up. That night, Janet drove to the address the man had given her. It was a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. She parked her car and walked to the door of one of the rooms. The man opened the door and motioned for her to come inside. Janet hesitated for a moment, but then stepped inside. The man closed the door behind her and motioned for her to sit down. He then told her the information she had been waiting for. "Your husband is in Mexico. He's been living there for the past few months. I can take you to him, but you have to give me the money back first." Janet was torn. She didn't want to give up the money, but she also didn't want to lose David again. The man could see the hesitation in her eyes. "Look, I'm not asking for the money back out of greed. I have people after me, and I need the money to get out of the country. If you want to find your husband, you have to trust me." Janet took a deep breath and made her decision. She pulled out the envelope with the money and handed it to the man. The man counted the money and then handed Janet a piece of paper with an address on it. "Meet me here tomorrow morning, and we'll leave for Mexico." Janet nodded and then left the room, feeling a mix of excitement and fear. The next morning, Janet woke up early and got ready to leave for Mexico. She didn't tell David where she was going. She didn't want to get his hopes up again. She drove to the address the man had given her and saw him waiting outside. He motioned for her to park the car and then got in the passenger seat. They drove for hours, crossing the border into Mexico. Janet was nervous, but she knew that she had to do whatever it took to find David. Finally, they arrived at a small village in the mountains. The man led Janet to a small house on the outskirts of the village. He knocked on the door, and a young woman answered. She spoke in Spanish to the man, and then motioned for Janet to come inside. Janet stepped inside the house and saw David sitting at a table, looking up at her in shock. "Janet, what are you doing here?" David asked. "I came to find you," Janet replied, tears welling up in her eyes. David stood up and walked over to Janet. They hugged each other tightly, both of them crying. The man who had brought Janet to Mexico spoke up. "I'll leave you two alone. I have to go now." Janet nodded and thanked the man. As he left, she turned to David. "What happened? Why did you leave?" David took a deep breath and then began to tell Janet his story. "After we lost the business, I felt like a failure. I didn't know what to do. I started drinking and gambling, and before I knew it, I had lost everything. I couldn't face you, so I left." Janet listened to David's story, her heart breaking for him. She knew how hard it had been for him to lose the business. They talked for hours, catching up on everything that had happened in their lives. They both apologized for the mistakes they had made. As the sun began to set, Janet knew that they had to leave. She didn't want to risk getting caught in Mexico after dark. David had hugged Janet one last time and then promised to come back with her to the United States. Janet drove them back across the border, both of them feeling a mix of relief and sadness. When they got back to the United States, Janet realized that they had no money left. She had given it all to the man who had helped her find David. Janet was shocked and devastated. She didn't know how they were going to survive. But then, something unexpected happened. As Janet and David were walking down the street, they passed a small store. An old gypsy woman was sitting outside, selling trinkets. Janet felt a sudden urge to talk to the woman. She walked over to her and struck up a conversation. As they were talking, the woman looked at Janet and then said 3 words that would change everything. The gypsy woman looked at Janet and said, "You found him." Janet was taken aback. "How did you know? Do you know David?" The woman shook her head. "No, but I can see that you've been looking for someone. You've been through a lot of pain and suffering, but you found him now." Janet was skeptical, but she couldn't deny that the woman's words had struck a chord with her. The gypsy woman looked at Janet intently. "You gave away all your money to find him, didn't you?" Janet was shocked. "How did you know that?" The woman smiled. "I have a gift. I can see things that others can't, and I can tell you that your sacrifice will be rewarded." Janet didn't know what to make of the woman's words, but something about her seemed genuine. She thanked the woman and then walked away with David. As they walked, Janet couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the gypsy woman's words than met the eye. That night, as they were settling into their hotel room, Janet couldn't sleep. She kept thinking about the woman's words. Finally, she got up and went for a walk. She ended up at the small store where the gypsy woman had been selling trinkets earlier that day. The woman was still there, packing up her things. She looked up and smiled when she saw Janet. "I knew you'd be back," she said. Janet took a deep breath and then asked, "What did you mean when you said that my sacrifice would be rewarded?" The woman's expression turned serious. "There are things in this world that we can't see or understand, but they exist nonetheless. You gave away your money to find your husband, and in doing so, you showed a great deal of courage and love. Those qualities will be rewarded in ways that you can't even imagine." Janet was confused but also intrigued. "What kind of rewards are you talking about?" The woman smiled enigmatically. "That's not for me to say. But trust in the universe. It has a way of working things out." Janet thanked the woman and then walked back to the hotel, still mulling over the woman's words. As the days and weeks passed, Janet and David tried to put their lives back together. It wasn't easy, but they had each other, and that was enough. But then, something unexpected happened. One day, Janet received a letter in the mail. It was from a lawyer, informing her that her great-aunt had died and left her a large sum of money. Janet was stunned. She had never met her great-aunt, but apparently, the woman had been impressed by Janet's work as a writer and had decided to leave her a portion of her estate. The money was enough to help Janet and David start a new business, and they used it to open a small bookstore in their town. As they were celebrating their new business venture, Janet couldn't help but think back to the gypsy woman's words. Had her sacrifice really been rewarded? But then, something else happened that made her question everything she thought she knew. David was going through some old papers when he came across a box of letters that Janet had written to him years ago. Janet had forgotten about the letters, but as David read them, he was shocked to discover that she had known about his gambling problem all along. Janet had written about her fears and her hopes for their future, but she had also expressed her anger and disappointment at David's behavior. David was devastated. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked Janet. "I tried to." After settling into her new life in rural Virginia, Janet decided to visit the nearby town to explore. She hadn't gone out much since moving there, and she was looking forward to seeing what the town had to offer. As she walked around, she noticed an old gypsy woman sitting on the side of the street, offering palm readings to passersby. Janet had never been to a fortune teller before, but she was intrigued. She approached the woman and asked if she could have her palm read. The old woman agreed and took Janet's hand in hers. As she studied Janet's palm, the old woman suddenly looked up at her and said, "You have a secret that is weighing heavily on your heart." Janet was taken aback. She did have a secret, but she had never told anyone about it. She wondered if the woman was just guessing, or if she really had some kind of psychic ability. "You gave all your money to a gypsy woman," the fortune teller continued, "but you were shocked at what your missing husband was hiding." Janet's heart skipped a beat. How could this woman know about her missing husband? She had kept that a secret from everyone, even her closest friends. "How do you know about my husband?" Janet asked, her voice trembling. The old woman looked at her solemnly. "I see things," she said, "and I can help you find the answers you seek." Janet didn't know what to think. She was skeptical of the woman's abilities, but at the same time, she was desperate for any information about her husband. She decided to take a chance and see what the woman had to say. "What do I have to do?" she asked. The old woman leaned in close and whispered 3 words in Janet's ear. Janet's eyes widened as she heard them, and she felt a chill run down her spine. "Meet me tomorrow," the woman said. "I will tell you more." Janet left the fortune teller feeling both excited and nervous. She didn't know what to expect, but she felt like she was finally going to get some answers about her missing husband. She went home and spent the rest of the day trying to prepare herself for what was to come. The next day, Janet returned to the spot where she had met the gypsy woman the day before. She looked around nervously, wondering if the woman would show up. After a few minutes of waiting, the old woman appeared from around a corner. "Come with me," she said, motioning for Janet to follow her. Janet followed the woman down a winding path that led into the woods. She felt uneasy, but she couldn't deny that she was curious about what the woman had to say. After a few minutes of walking, they arrived at a small clearing. The woman sat down on a rock and motioned for Janet to join her. "Your husband is not missing," the woman said bluntly. Janet's heart sank. "What do you mean?" she asked. "He left you," the woman said. "He's been living with another woman for years." Janet felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over her. She had suspected something like this, but she had never been able to prove it. "How do you know this?" she asked the woman. "I see things," the woman repeated, "and I can help you find him." Janet was skeptical. She didn't know if she could trust this woman, but at the same time, she didn't know where else to turn. She decided to hear her out. "What do I have to do?" she asked. The old woman looked at her intently. "You have to give me everything you have," she said. "Your money, your possessions, everything." Janet was taken aback. She didn't have much, but what little she did have was important to her. She didn't know if she could give it all away. "Why?" she asked. "Because I need it to perform a ritual," the woman said. "It's the only way to find him." Janet didn't know what to do. She wanted to find her husband, but she didn't know if she could trust this woman. She decided to think about it and told the woman she would get back to her. As she walked back home, Janet couldn't stop thinking about what the old woman had told her. She felt a mixture of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, but also a sense of hope that she might be able to find her husband after all these years. She knew she had to make a decision, but she didn't know what to do. Over the next few days, Janet couldn't stop thinking about the gypsy woman's offer. She didn't know if she could trust her, but at the same time, she couldn't deny that she was curious about what the woman could do. She decided to do some research on the woman and see if she could find out more about her. After a few days of asking around, Janet discovered that the gypsy woman was well known in the area. People said she'd helped them find lost items and even missing people before. This gave Janet some hope that the woman might be able to help her too. Janet went back to the woman and told her that she would agree to the ritual. She gathered all of her possessions and met the woman at the same spot in the woods. The woman took everything Janet had and started to perform the ritual. Janet watched nervously as the woman chanted and burned incense. After several minutes, the woman stopped and looked at Janet. "I see him," she said. Janet's heart skipped a beat. "Where is he?" she asked. "He's in a small town about 200 miles from here," the woman said. "But be careful, he's in trouble." Janet was confused. "What kind of trouble?" she asked. "I can't say," the woman said. "But you must go to him and help him." Janet didn't know what to do. She had just given away everything she had, and now she was being asked to travel to a strange town to help her missing husband. But she knew she had to do it. She set out on a long journey to the town the woman had told her about. When she arrived, she started asking around about her husband. It wasn't long before she found out where he was staying. As she approached the house, she heard shouting and yelling. She knew she had to be careful, but she couldn't just stand by and do nothing. She took a deep breath and knocked on the door. A man answered, looking surprised to see her. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm looking for my husband," Janet said. The man looked at her suspiciously. "What husband?" "My husband," Janet said. "He's been missing for years, and I was told he was here." The man's expression changed, and he stepped aside to let Janet in. "Come with me," he said. He led her down a hallway and into a back room. Janet's heart sank when she saw her husband sitting there, bruised and battered. "What happened?" she asked, rushing to his side. He looked up at her, surprised to see her there. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't want you to see me like this." Janet was confused. "What happened?" she asked again. Her husband told her everything. He had gotten involved with some dangerous people and had been in trouble for years. He had been hiding from them, but they had finally caught up with him. Janet was shocked. She had no idea her husband had been living this kind of life. But she also knew she couldn't leave him there. She helped him to his feet and led him out of the house. As they walked down the street, Janet knew that their lives would never be the same again. But she also knew that they were in it together, no matter what. As they walked through the town, Janet tried to process everything she had just heard. She couldn't believe that her husband had been living this kind of life. She had always thought he was a simple man, content with their quiet life in the country. She had no idea he had been involved in something so dangerous. Her husband could sense her confusion and guilt. "I'm sorry, Janet," he said. "I should have told you. I didn't want you to get hurt." Janet shook her head. "We'll talk about it later," she said. "Right now, we need to get out of here." They made their way to a bus station and bought tickets to the nearest city. They didn't have much money left, but they knew they had to leave town as soon as possible. As they sat on the bus, Janet couldn't help but wonder what else her husband had been hiding from her. She thought about all the years he had been gone and the pain she had felt. She couldn't imagine how he could keep something like this a secret. When they arrived in the city, they had nowhere to go. They were broke and had no friends or family in the area. They spent the night in a homeless shelter and tried to figure out what to do next. Janet knew they couldn't stay in the city for long. Her husband's enemies would be looking for him, and she didn't want to put anyone else in danger. She decided they needed to leave the country. They spent the next few days trying to gather enough money to buy plane tickets. Janet sold everything she had left and took odd jobs around the city. It was hard work, but she knew it was necessary. Finally, they had enough money to buy tickets to a foreign country. They packed their bags and boarded the plane, ready for a new life. As they flew over the ocean, Janet couldn't help but feel a sense of relief. They were leaving everything behind and starting fresh. She hoped that they could leave their past behind and move on. But as they landed in their new country, Janet realized that their problems weren't over yet. They had no job, no friends, and no place to live. They were starting from scratch in a foreign country, and Janet didn't know if they could make it. But she knew she had to try. For the first time in years, she felt like they had a chance at a new life. She took her husband's hand and led him out of the airport, ready to face whatever came their way. Janet and her husband found themselves in a bustling foreign city. The sights and sounds were overwhelming, but Janet felt a sense of excitement. They were starting fresh in a new place, and anything was possible. Their first order of business was finding a place to stay. They didn't have much money left, so they couldn't afford a fancy hotel. They ended up renting a small apartment in a rundown building on the outskirts of the city. The apartment was small and cramped, but it was all they could afford. They spent their first night there sleeping on the floor, using their bags as pillows. Over the next few weeks, Janet and her husband tried to adjust to their new life. They spent most of their time looking for work and exploring the city. They didn't have many friends, but they were happy to be together. Despite their best efforts, they were struggling to make ends meet. Janet's odd jobs weren't enough to pay the rent and put food on the table. They needed something more. One day, Janet saw a help wanted sign in a window. The job was for a waitress at a local restaurant. It wasn't glamorous, but it was a job. She applied and was hired on the spot. Janet was grateful for the job, but it was hard work. The restaurant was always busy, and she had to work long hours on her feet. But she didn't mind. She was making money, and that was all that mattered. As Janet's job kept them afloat, her husband struggled to find work. His lack of experience and language skills made it difficult for him to find a job. He spent his days wandering the city, looking for work, and trying to improve his language skills. One day, he stumbled upon a group of men playing cards in a park. He struck up a conversation with them and ended up joining their game. They were impressed with his skills and invited him to play again the next day. The card game became a regular thing for Janet's husband. He played every day and slowly started to make friends with the other men. They were all from the same country as him, and they welcomed him into their group. But Janet was worried. She didn't like the idea of her husband getting involved with people she didn't know. She didn't want him to get into any more trouble. She voiced her concerns to her husband, but he dismissed them. He said he needed to make friends and that these men were good people. He promised her that everything would be okay. Janet tried to believe him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She didn't know what it was, but she knew she didn't like it. As time went on, Janet's husband continued to spend more and more time with his new friends. He started staying out later and coming home drunk. Janet was worried and upset, but she didn't know what to do. One night, Janet's husband didn't come home at all. She waited up all night, but he never showed. She called the police, but they told her there was nothing they could do until he had been missing for 24 hours. Janet was frantic. She didn't know where her husband was or what had happened to him. She spent the next few days searching for him, but she couldn't find any trace of him. One day, while walking through a crowded marketplace, Janet was approached by an old gypsy woman. The woman was wrinkled and haggard, with a shawl wrapped around her head. She spoke in broken English and offered to tell Janet's fortune. Janet was skeptical, but she was desperate for answers. She sat down at the woman's makeshift table and let her read her palm. The woman told Janet that she saw great sadness in her future and that her husband was in danger. Janet scoffed at the woman's words. She didn't believe in fortune-telling and thought the woman was just trying to scam her out of money. But then, the old gypsy woman said something that caught Janet's attention. She told Janet that her husband was not who he seemed. She said that he was hiding a great secret, and that he had done something terrible. Janet was stunned. She didn't know what to make of the woman's words. But then, the old gypsy woman took Janet's hand and wrote 3 words on it in black ink. "Look for him," the woman said, and then she disappeared into the crowd. Janet was confused and frightened. She didn't know what the woman's words meant, but she knew she had to find her husband. She spent the next few days searching the city, asking questions and following leads. Finally, she found a man who claimed to have seen her husband with a group of men in a rundown apartment building on the edge of the city. Janet went to the building and knocked on the door of the apartment. No one answered at first, but then a man opened the door and let her in. The apartment was dark and dingy, with empty beer bottles and cigarette butts littering the floor. Janet's heart sank when she saw her husband sitting at a table with the same group of men he had been playing cards with. He looked tired and defeated, and he didn't even look up when she walked in. Janet demanded to know what was going on, but her husband just shook his head and looked away. The men at the table looked at her with cold, hard eyes. Janet knew she was in trouble. She tried to leave, but the men blocked her way. She was trapped. Then one of the men spoke up. He told Janet that her husband owed them money, a lot of money, and that he had been playing cards with them to try and win it back. But he had lost, and now he couldn't pay. Janet was horrified. She had no idea that her husband was gambling away their money. She begged the men to let them go, but they refused. They told her that they would let them go if she gave them all the money she had. Janet didn't know what to do. She had no money left, except for a few bills she had tucked away in her pocket. She pulled them out and handed them over to the men. But it wasn't enough. They demanded more. They told her that if she didn't give them everything she had, they would. Janet was devastated by her husband's disappearance. She and David had been married for 25 years and had never spent a day apart until the day he disappeared. David was an adventurer at heart and loved to travel. He had always wanted to go to the Amazon rainforest, and 2 years before his disappearance, he decided to go on a solo expedition to Brazil. Janet had always been supportive of David's dreams, but the thought of him going alone into the Amazon rainforest scared her. David promised to be careful and assured her that he would be back before she knew it. But he didn't come back, and Janet had no idea where he was or what had happened to him. Janet spent the first few months after David's disappearance in a daze, hoping against hope that he would come back to her. She tried to contact the Brazilian authorities, but they were not very helpful. David had not filed a travel itinerary or notified anyone of his plans, so the authorities did not have any leads. As the months turned into years, Janet resigned herself to the fact that David was most likely dead. She grieved for him and tried to move on with her life, but she could never forget him. She would spend hours looking at old photographs of the two of them together and wondering what had happened to her beloved husband. One day, Janet was walking through the streets of the city when she saw a group of gypsy women gathered around a small tent. Janet had always been fascinated by fortune tellers and decided to have her fortune told. She entered the tent and sat down across from an old woman who looked as if she had been doing this for centuries. The gypsy woman took Janet's hand and began to read her palm. She told Janet that she had a long and prosperous life ahead of her, but that she would face many challenges. Janet was intrigued by the fortune teller's words and asked her if she could tell her more about her future. The gypsy woman closed her eyes and began to chant a strange incantation. After a few moments, she opened her eyes and looked at Janet. "You have a great secret, my dear," she said. "A secret that has been hidden from you for many years. You will soon learn the truth about your missing husband." Janet was shocked by the gypsy woman's words. She had never told anyone about David's disappearance, so how could this woman know about it? She asked the fortune teller to explain, but the old woman only smiled mysteriously and said, "The truth will be revealed to you when you least expect it." Janet left the tent feeling both excited and uneasy. She wondered if the gypsy woman's words were just a coincidence, or if there was some truth to them. She tried to put the incident out of her mind, but she couldn't help feeling that there was something important about the gypsy woman's prediction. Months passed, and Janet had almost forgotten about the gypsy woman's prediction when something strange happened. Janet was at home, going through some of David's old belongings, when she found a letter that he had written to her just before he left for his Amazon expedition. The letter was filled with his hopes and dreams, and his excitement about the journey ahead. But it also contained a secret that David had been keeping from Janet for years. In the letter, David confessed to having an affair with another woman before he left for Brazil. He said that he had ended the affair and begged Janet's forgiveness, but he had never told her about it because he was afraid of losing her. Janet was devastated by the news. She felt as if she didn't even know David anymore. She wondered how he could have kept such a big secret from her for so long. Janet didn't know what to do. She felt like she couldn't trust anyone, not even her own husband. As Janet was crying over the letter, she remembered the gypsy woman's prediction. Could this be the secret that the fortune teller had been talking about? Janet couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the gypsy woman's words. Janet decided to go back to the gypsy woman's tent and ask her about the prediction. She found the tent in the same spot and entered, but this time, the old woman wasn't alone. There was another woman in the tent, a younger woman who looked about Janet's age. The younger woman looked up as Janet entered the tent and smiled warmly at her. "Welcome, my dear," she said. "I'm Maria. I've been expecting you." Janet was taken aback by the woman's words. "Expecting me? How could you have known I was coming?" Maria smiled again. "The spirits speak to me, my dear. They told me that you would be here." Janet was skeptical, but she was also curious. "Can you tell me more about the prediction that the other woman made?" she asked. Maria looked at Janet with concern in her eyes. "You must be careful, my dear," she said. "The future is not always what we want it to be. Sometimes it's better not to know." But Janet was determined to find out what the prediction meant. She begged Maria to tell her, and eventually, the younger woman relented. "The Gypsy woman's prediction was not about your missing husband," Maria said. "It was about you. You will face a great challenge soon, one that will test you in ways you can't even imagine. But you will also find strength and courage that you never knew you had. And in the end, you will emerge victorious." Janet was confused by Maria's words. "What challenge?" she asked. "What do you mean?" But Maria only shook her head. "I cannot say more, my dear," she said. "The spirits have spoken, and I have said all that I can." Janet left the tent feeling even more confused than before. She didn't know what to make of the Gypsy women's predictions, but she felt as if something big was about to happen in her life. She just didn't know what it was. If you liked this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We share amazing stories from people's lives every day that won't leave you indifferent. Thanks for watching.